All right, I chose to do the Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannon. I do have a script here. God bless the person who can do it without a script. Basically, essentially, what the story is about, what the article is about, is that she attempts to share the story of Hamlet with the Tiv people of Nigeria. She believes that the themes of Shakespeare's work were basically universal and would be understood by anybody across different cultures. However, as the story is told, basically the Tiv interpreted each part in their own cultural lens, which was challenging her assumptions about family, about death, about the supernatural. Rather than seeing Hamlet as a tragic tale of betrayal and revenge, the Tiv basically redefined the character's motivations based on their own traditions, beliefs, and their worldview. They just kind of, made up their own interpretation of what was going on. See next, the article. It honestly it does a pretty good job of illustrating how worldviews shape interpretation. For the Tiv, the idea of a ghost central to Hamlet's plot was not a spiritual sign of unfinished business, but a form of witchcraft. Similarly, they couldn't accept that Hamlet's mother marrying his uncle was morally wrong in their culture. It was expected for a brother to marry the widow, and I can't even read my own handwriting. Ramon's still typing, I should say. Okay. These reinterpretations demonstrate that the meaning is never universal. Our worldviews filters what we see as right, wrong, normal, or even logical in this sense. The author basically assumed that she was sharing an objective story, but the Tiv reminded her that all narratives are viewed through a cultural lens. One of the clear ethnocentric biases in the article is when the author's initial assumption of cultural superiority, that Shakespeare's insights to the human nature, they were universal, essentially, as I explained at the beginning. She believed that Hamlet would reveal the shared truths of human experience. This bias stems from her Western academic worldview, which basically prioritized certain literary traditions as inherently superior global. Only after her conversation, essentially, with the Tiv people, did she begin to realize that other cultures were equally valid and had their own interpretive frameworks. Her frustration with the Tiv, when the Tiv misunderstood the story, reflects a subtle form of cultural arrogance, thinking her way of understanding the story was essentially the correct one. This story, it challenges the idea that one's cultural values are normal or best, so to speak. The author, Bohannon, thought that certain moral or emotional reactions like grief, betrayal, justice would be interpreted the same way everywhere. But the Tiv's response showed that was not considered normal at all. That it was considered normal and deeply cultural. Their interpretations weren't wrong. They were consistent with their own moral system and their own social structure. This reminds us that no culture has a monopoly on the truth, and that calling something normal or often just means familiar to themselves or familiar to me, if you're using the term normal. In my own culture, I suppose in our culture, I place a strong emphasis on individual independence, or at least I shouldn't say I do. In our culture, they place a strong emphasis on individual independence, especially in young adulthood. Moving out at 18, making one's own way through, considered a sign of maturity. But in many collectivist cultures, this might be seen as abandoning your family or disrespecting your elders. An outsider might interpret this norm kind of cold and uncaring, while we see it as more like empowering and like just encouraging them, oh, go do your thing, This difference, like the Tiv's view of marriage or ghosts, reflects how deeply worldview shapes up behavior and judgment, I think. Get close to the end here. A key best practice for intercultural communication is cultural humility, the willingness to listen, learn, and without judgment, rather than imposing our own interpretations. We should be curious and open to how others perceive the world. I'm just reading this straight through because it's easier with this question. If the author had approached the story not as a test of universality, but as a conversation between cultures, she might have better appreciated the richness of the Tiv people and their worldview. One example would be like the Tiv reinterpret the ghost as a witch. This is ignorance. It's a meaningful expression of how their culture understands the supernatural, essentially. As far as my personal experience with cultural misunderstanding, I once worked with a colleague from a high context culture where indirect communication was the norm. I interpreted her avoidance of direct answers as evasive or maybe just like indecisive. Later I learned the culture is too direct and considered rude or confrontational. Similarly, in this article, the author misreads the Tiv's reactions and misunderstandings. Both examples can show how different worldviews lead to miscommunication. My final takeaway is, I guess the most significant lesson I learned from this article is that worldview shapes everything, from how we tell our stories to how we interpret the truth. Intercultural communication isn't just about translating words. It's bridging entire systems of meaning. We hope to connect basically across cultures. We must first recognize our own assumptions and then approach others with humility, empathy, curiosity, and really only then can we kind of begin to understand the truth. Whew, made it. Thank you.